Professor, thank you very much for joining me. Very grateful for your time. The risks of the vaccine are still very, very low, aren't they?
They are, absolutely. And this is a really important consideration here. It's approximately 1 to 2 in every 100,000 patients who receive that vaccine of getting the blood clots. And actually, we still don't know whether the problem was inherent with the vaccine technology, this adenoviral vector, that basically you put a bit of the protein inside another virus and you spread that round, or whether it's the protein itself, because we know that if you caught COVID at the time this vaccine was being rolled out, you were 300 times more likely to develop the same blood clots that you got from the vaccine. So this was a risk, but the problem was that something that happens 1 in 100,000 times or 2 in 100,000 times was never going to be picked up in the sorts of studies that we're required to do, the 50,000 people in a trial.
But do you think that the government was too optimistic, that it gave the impression that there was virtually no risk? And also when it came to deciding to vaccinate children for whom the risk of COVID was so low, no one really went through the balance of risks as the vaccine was being rolled out.
So using the word safe with any medicine is always a dangerous thing to do. We never know the full risks. If you give a drug for 50,000 people in a trial, we have no idea of risks that are going to be 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000. We just won't pick them up in those trials. However, it was all about balancing the risk at the time of COVID versus the risk that had been demonstrated with the vaccine. You've got to remember, at the time that this was taking place, I was looking after COVID patients and I was seeing more deaths in a week than I'd seen in a 12-month period as a typical consultant. So this was something that was killing people at a rate that we hadn't seen. When it comes to vaccinating... Go on.
So, and that's so important, that the risk for people who are elderly or were ill in some way was absolutely negligible compared to the benefit, and millions of lives were saved by Astrazeneca. It's crucial to remember that, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the figures this was groundbreaking research. It was really well supported by the British government, and we did a tremendous job of getting that into people's arms faster than anyone else in the world. It's estimated that this vaccine alone has saved about 6.5 million lives around the world. And the UK has a lot to be proud of here. We have the groundbreaking research. Then, as the factors came out, as it became apparent that this vaccine was associated with the clots, however rare, and it was decided or determined that that was more so in the younger people, we were also the first to act. We stopped the vaccination for this AstraZeneca vaccine for anybody under the age of 40, where the risk was deemed to be higher, and we used alternative vaccine strategies for those people. So this was all a balance of risk versus benefit, and at the time I firmly believe the decisions that were made were right. But now that vaccine is no longer relevant. It's a vaccine against a version of a virus that isn't in circulation anymore. The difference between COVID that's circulating now and that original COVID is massive. It's actually bigger than the difference between the original COVID and the SARS epidemic in China in 2012. So the vaccine itself is now not relevant to the COVID that's in circulation. So it's entirely appropriate it's being withdrawn.
What do you think administrators should learn from this experience and from the admission that it did create the clotting? Because I know that as a constituency MP, my mailbag will now get quite a few letters from people saying, look, I told you so. And my worry is that the PR around the vaccine was too positive early on, which is very helpful to the conspiracy theorists now.
Absolutely. I mean, when the vaccine was first launched, its primary aim was to stop people dying, stop people ending up in ITU. It was then also touted that it would stop infection spreading, and that played a massive part in the need to get it. You know, you have to have this to reduce it spreading. Well, That was never actually tested in the studies. I think it's really important we come up front and we say, look, this is a vaccine that is designed to stop people from dying. It does reduce spread, but nowhere near as much as we originally hoped for. And by the time we were on our third or fourth variant, by the time we went through Alpha, Delta, and Omicron, it wasn't preventing the spread, but it still has kept people out of hospital. And that's the important thing. It's all about honesty. It's about saying that this is a vaccine that has saved millions of lives. It did come with a very small risk. The word safe should never be used with any new medication, irrespective of whether that's a vaccine or a new drug for diabetes, heart disease, or whatever you care to mention, until we've had it for a few years.
And it's a balance of risks, isn't it? And that actually governments, administrators, and the population at large aren't brilliant at judging the balance of risks. And the only bit of the rollout I was concerned about when it was being given to school children who seemed to have such a low risk from COVID itself, and yet it became, partly because of the mistake about reducing spread or reducing spread significantly, it became part of the policy even though this wasn't going to help children. And I thought the risks then weren't being weighed up properly.
So it's important to say that the Astrazeneca vaccine was never given to children. We already were aware of the blood clotting problems in people under the age of 40. So this particular vaccine was never given to children. The decision to give the vaccination to children was based on two principles. You've got to remember that COVID, although it had a very low risk in children, was still the number one cause of death of children in the UK and in the States in 2020 and 2021. So although it was a very low risk, it was not a negligible risk. The other thing is, by the time that decision was made, it was clear that although the vaccine doesn't stop spread, it reduced spread by about 30 to 40%. And as our children getting back to school, which was absolutely essential, we got them back into that mixing phase into school, we knew that schools become a petri dish for virals. Any parent knows that their children regularly bring home all sorts of infections. And so just reducing the infection risk by a third increased the chance of those children growing up with two parents and full sets of grandparents. However, the principal reason for vaccinating children was all about this very low but not insignificant risk of death due to COVID, and of course, long COVID. We still have around 120,000 children in the UK that are not participating with school normally because of the prolonged effects of this virus. And 120,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot of children. It's about in every other classroom that we're seeing here. And we know the vaccine did reduce the risk of that by over 50%.
So overall, we should be really proud of AstraZeneca. They saved 6.5 million lives. It was a great British success story. The economy opened up earlier. Perhaps the PR should have been a little bit more cautious. But in the grand scheme of things, the errors were relatively minor.
And the UK government did a tremendous job of getting behind the whole vaccination programme from start to finish to give the Oxford University and the companies the confidence to explore this, not just AstraZeneca, but the other companies who had the vaccines that didn't work, without that original support to say, we will underwrite these vaccines to get us out of the pandemic, to get us out of lockdown, to get us back to a position where we can be in a room together. That was a tremendous success story of both the British government underwriting this, so the National Health Service that got this into the arm quicker than any other health service in the world.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm very grateful for your time. And we have a statement, a few words from AstraZeneca. According to independent estimates, over 6.5 million lives were saved in the first year of use alone, and over 3 billion doses were supplied globally. As multiple variant COVID-19 vaccines have since been developed, there is a surplus of available updated vaccines. This has led to a decline in demand for Vaxzevria, which is no longer being manufactured or supplied.